Something extraordinary unfolded on national television, something even seasoned political watchers weren't prepared for. Imagine this: a sitting governor, the leader responsible for an entire state's systems, budget, and accountability, is confronted on live TV about fraud so enormous it dwarfs the entire annual budget of Minnesota's Department of Corrections. It should have been a moment for clarity, reassurance, and leadership. But instead, it became a meltdown that shocked millions across the country. This wasn't a rogue off-camera remark or a leaked audio clip. This happened live, unfiltered, for everyone to see. And when the questions came, tough but fair questions, the governor didn't stand tall, didn't own the moment, didn't even attempt to steady the ship. Instead, he swayed. His tone shifted. His answers cracked under pressure. And then, almost unbelievably, he tried to blame everyone except the person in the mirror. He blamed critics. He blamed the media. He even implied the people asking the questions were somehow in the wrong. At one point, he suggested that pointing out fraud, literal theft of taxpayer money, and was equivalent to demonizing communities. And that's when viewers realized the interview wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unraveling in real time. This video breaks down exactly what happened. Why Governor Tim Walz found himself in the biggest political crisis of his career, and why MSNBC, a network often friendly to Democrats, pressed him harder than anyone expected. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why his reaction was so chaotic, why the scandal matters far beyond Minnesota, and why it's now gaining national attention from citizens, investigators, and political insiders alike. Let's walk through it step by step, because the deeper you go, the stranger the story becomes. The interview took place on Meet the Press, with host Kristen Welker sitting across from Governor Tim Walz. The topic was fraud in Minnesota's social services system during the CO9 pandemic. Not a small issue, not a bureaucratic mistake, but an explosion of fraud estimated between several $100 million and over $1 billion stolen. To put that in perspective, Minnesota spends less than that each year operating its entire prison system. Let that sink in. Criminals stole more taxpayer money than the cost of running every prison in the state. Now imagine you're a lifelong taxpayer watching this interview. You've worked hard, paid your dues, and believed your money was going toward roads, schools, healthcare, and programs to help families in real need. And suddenly, you discover that an enormous chunk of it was siphoned away through fraudulent programs and on the governor's watch. So the obvious question came: who let this happen? Who failed to prevent it? Who is responsible? Kristen Welker did what every concerned citizen wished they could do. She asked Walz directly, "Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?" This was the moment, the leadership moment, where clarity was needed. Instead, Walz gave an answer that raised more questions than it resolved. He responded, "Certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems." At first glance, it might sound strong, but listen more carefully. He wasn't taking responsibility for failing to prevent the fraud. He was taking credit for prosecuting criminals after the system had already been looted. That's like a bank security guard saying, "I take responsibility for calling the cops once the vault was emptied." It completely sidesteps the real issue. Then came an even stranger explanation. Walz said Minnesota is a generous, prosperous, well-run state with an 80 bond rating, and that this success attracts criminals. It was almost as if he claimed the fraud was a side effect of doing such a great job running the state. But here's the flaw in that logic. If your systems are so great, shouldn't they include safeguards to stop criminals from stealing $1 billion? Imagine leaving your front door unlocked every night and then blaming burglars for being attracted to your nice neighborhood. That's what his argument sounded like to viewers. Most people understand that being in a good place doesn't excuse bad security. This disconnect is what instantly concerns so many people watching, especially older viewers who spent years managing households, businesses, and communities. Leadership isn't just about celebrating successes. It's about acknowledging failures and fixing them. But the interview got even more tense. Walz shifted the conversation toward Minnesota's Somali community, describing them as educators, artists, entrepreneurs, and valuable contributors to the state's diversity. All of that is true. But then he accused people of demonizing an entire community because of the actions of a few individuals. This was another moment viewers noticed. Because the question wasn't about ethnicity. It wasn't about race, culture, or community. It was about leadership. It was about accountability. And by reframing the question as prejudice, Walz effectively dodged it entirely. This rhetorical technique is called deflection, changing the subject without addressing the core issue. And for many viewers, this was a red flag, because the fraud didn't appear out of nowhere. Prosecutors have repeatedly identified members of the East African diaspora as key players in the schemes. That's not bias. That's what the legal cases say. And ignoring that reality doesn't protect anyone, not the victims, not taxpayers, and not the honest members of that community who had nothing to do with the crimes. But what came next was even more explosive. After the interview aired, the public learned that this wasn't a surprise to state officials. It wasn't a sudden crisis. It wasn't something that just appeared out of thin air. People inside the system had been raising red flags for months, even years. Enter the whistleblowers, current and former workers inside Minnesota's Department of Human Services claimed they raised alarms repeatedly, warning that the fraud was growing, that oversight was weak, and that major vulnerabilities were being ignored. Some whistleblowers even said they reported the issues directly to leadership, only to be brushed aside or overruled. This revelation changed everything. It suggested the fraud wasn't just a failure of prevention. It might have been a failure of leadership, oversight, and responsiveness. And that's why this scandal is gaining traction now, on a national level. Because if whistleblowers were warning the administration, and if prosecutors were identifying organized networks exploiting state programs, and if hundreds of millions of dollars were still allowed to disappear, then the questions about accountability only grow louder. This isn't just about Minnesota. It's about government oversight in every state. It's about the responsibilities of elected officials. It's about the trust citizens place in leaders to guard taxpayer money. And ultimately, it's about integrity, not just when things go right, but when they go disastrously wrong. Governor Walz's interview was supposed to reassure the public. Instead, it opened a deeper conversation about leadership, responsibility, and the consequences of deflection under pressure. And judging by the reaction from citizens, investigators, and even people inside his own party, this political firestorm is far from over. The unfolding scandal inside Minnesota's Department of Human Services has revealed far more than administrative negligence. It has exposed a crisis of leadership, oversight, and trust. It began quietly, with staff members doing exactly what taxpayers expect of them, paying attention, documenting problems, and reporting fraud. But instead of support, these employees found themselves stepping into a storm no one was prepared to confront. In a moment of desperation, these staff members created an online account solely to share what they had witnessed behind closed doors. Their message was concise but explosive. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on. We hoped for a partnership in stopping fraud, but we got the opposite response. The weight of those words carried a deeper meaning, a sense of betrayal by the very people entrusted with protecting public resources. According to these whistleblowers, their attempts to report wrongdoing did not result in investigations or reforms. Instead, they faced retaliation, surveillance, intimidation, subtle threats, and attempts to discredit their professionalism. They described the atmosphere as scary and isolating, leaving them unsure who, if anyone, they could turn to. When people tasked with safeguarding taxpayer dollars become targets for doing their jobs, it speaks to a fundamental breakdown in governance. These weren't rebellious employees. They were civil servants trying to protect programs meant to help the vulnerable. Yet rather than being applauded for diligence, they were punished for inconvenient truths. One of the most alarming claims from these employees involves the weakening of the office of the Legislative Auditor, Minnesota's independent watchdog. Designed to ensure transparency, audits, and accountability, this office is a critical guardrail against corruption. But the whistleblowers say Governor Walz effectively disempowered it, allowing agencies to sidestep or downplay audit findings. This is the equivalent of disabling the smoke. Alarms in a building while knowing full well that electrical problems exist. When oversight systems are weakened, disaster is not a possibility, it is an inevitability. The scale of that disaster became impossible to ignore. One program created to feed hungry children during the COVID pandemic became the target of what investigators now call one of the largest fraud schemes in state history. The estimated loss? Between $200 and $300 million, siphoned away from kids into private pockets. A defense attorney for one convicted fraudster summed it up chillingly. It was like taking candy from a baby. The ease with which criminals exploited. The system raises disturbing questions about internal controls or the lack thereof. And the food program was only one part of the crisis. Fraud in autism-related services ballooned to an estimated $300 to $400 million, targeting families in desperate need of support. The Housing Assistance Program, originally budgeted at a modest $2 to $3 million, exploded to nearly $100 million before federal investigators intervened. At those numbers together, and the total fraud easily exceeds $500 million, possibly pushing past $1 billion depending on which estimates you consider. That is more money than Minnesota spends each year on its entire correctional system. And yet the financial loss tells only part of the story. Federal authorities discovered that significant portions of this money were quietly wired overseas, some to countries with unstable governments. The deeply unsettling implication is that a portion of stolen U.S. taxpayer dollars may have indirectly supported extremist networks abroad. Federal investigators remain cautious about drawing final conclusions, but the possibility alone has shaken public confidence. When citizens pay taxes, they enter a social contract, expecting roads, schools, safety, and aid for those who need it, not a pipeline of stolen funds flowing into corruption or global instability. The scandal grew so large that even networks known for their friendlier treatment of Democratic politicians could no longer ignore it. That is why MSNBC's Kristen Welker confronted Governor Walz with unusually direct questioning. It wasn't partisan pressure. It was the sheer weight of facts. Her audience wanted answers. Taxpayers wanted accountability. And for the first time in a long time, the governor was required to address the crisis publicly and without filters. But instead of a clear acknowledgement of responsibility, viewers saw deflection. When asked directly, "Do you take responsibility?" Walz did not deliver the firm, confident leadership people expected. Instead, he pivoted, shifting the conversation toward his critics, and then strangely toward Donald Trump. In a moment that baffled many observers, Walz suggested Trump was physically fading and showing signs of mental decline, citing a Thanksgiving message Trump had posted online. The connection to Minnesota's fraud crisis was unclear, and the deflection appeared desperate. The timing made it worse. The same day Walz questioned Trump's mental fitness, Trump appeared in interviews speaking energetically, laying out detailed policy positions. Whether one agrees with Trump or not, he did not appear confused or deteriorating. So Walz's remark looked like a political attempt to change the subject, and it backfired. When reporters brought Walz's comments to Trump aboard Air Force One, Trump delivered a direct response, brushing off the insult and turning the conversation back toward the scandal. He criticized Walz for failing to control fraud and for allowing taxpayer money to flow into regions with unstable governments. Trump's bluntness created headlines, but it also redirected national attention to the core issue. Why did Minnesota lose control of its own programs? As the media cycle intensified, something else happened, something far more consequential. The whistleblowers' posts from inside the Department of Human Services went viral, reaching nearly 20 million people. Their testimonies resonated because they felt real, raw, and grounded in first-hand experience. These were not anonymous online accounts. These were individuals who identified themselves as current employees, staking their reputations on the truth. Their stories painted a disturbing picture. When fraud was reported, investigators were not deployed to scrutinize the fraudulent actors. Instead, agencies scrutinized the whistleblowers themselves. It was not fraud that triggered internal alarm. It was the people trying to stop the fraud, and in many cases concerns were dismissed, because leadership feared appearing discriminatory toward specific communities. The tragic irony is that by refusing to act out of fear of optics, officials allowed criminals to exploit vulnerable populations and siphon off money meant for struggling families. This logic, protecting appearances instead of protecting taxpayers, left programs underfunded, communities underserved, and honest public employees demoralized. Minnesotans have reacted with outrage. On social media, in community meetings, and in interviews, residents are asking why their governor spent more time attacking Trump than addressing fraud in his own administration. Even some who had supported Walz began to express concern about his lack of accountability. They want answers. Why were whistleblowers ignored? Why did oversight break down? Why did it take federal investigators and not state leaders to uncover the full extent of the fraud? Elections are approaching, And political observers wonder whether this scandal will follow Walz into future races. His response in the coming months may determine his political trajectory more than any policy proposal. But beyond politics lies a deeper lesson for all Americans. This crisis demonstrates the importance of oversight, transparency, and leadership that prioritizes truth over optics. It shows how fragile public trust can be and how quickly it evaporates when leaders fail to act decisively. Fraud is not a partisan issue. Theft is not a left versus right debate. When taxpayer money is stolen, everyone loses, regardless of their political beliefs. And as federal prosecutions continue, dozens have already been convicted, with more cases pending. Some face sentences of 10, 15, even 20 years. Justice is moving forward, but the damage to public confidence will take years to repair.